Thank you very much, and welcome all to Call's webinar on adaptation and resilience in the face of climate change. Our presentation today by Dr. Jennifer Penney. We are speaking to you today from Toronto in the Dish with One Spoon territory, and this territory covers the lower Great Lake lowlands, extending up to Montreal and Quebec, and from Lake Simcoe down into the northern New York state. This territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, which was a treaty created between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect that land. And subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples and Europeans and all newcomers that have moved into this land have been invited into this territory and into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Before we proceed to the webinar, I'd like to give a few points about CALL. We have a number of visitors who are not members of CALL on our webinar this morning, and we'd like to introduce ourselves to you. CALL is an acronym for Climate Action Lifelong Learners, and we believe in our organization that climate change can move us from curiosity to knowledge to action, and that a key thing about our group is to deepen our knowledge about climate change, the effects, the impacts, the origins, so that we can be more effective in our actions to combat or deal with policy and political issues. We learn through our monthly meetings, such as this meeting today, and through specific interest groups that are focused on individual actions that we can take in our personal lives, political and policy advocacy actions that we can take, as well as understanding the various nature-based solutions that are available to us. We believe in working together with many organizations in order to be most effective, and we do work frequently with SCAN. Many of our members are also SCAN members, and with many of the other environmental groups that are concerned about climate effects. If you wish to contact us, please come to our website. We're at climatelearners.ca. Or email us, contact us at climatelearners.ca. And I really do recommend subscribing to our monthly newsletter. It is full of information on climate change policy in Canada, effects and impacts that are occurring elsewhere, as well as a number of links to webcasts, webinars, and podcasts that will deepen your knowledge. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Jennifer Penney. Jennifer has a doctorate in work environment policy from the University of Massachusetts at Lowell and a master in environmental studies. She worked for many years in occupational health and safety before joining the Clean Air Partnership. And then from 2004 to 2010, she served as Director of Research at CAP. And during that time, organized a number of webinars and workshops for municipalities to help them understand the adaptation required to meet the forthcoming challenges of climate change. She was also a key author during this period on the first City of Toronto Climate Change Adaptation Strategy that was approved by Council in 2008. Since retiring, Jennifer has been a very active member of both CALL and SCAN, contributing to our knowledge at CALL on climate change adaptation and a number of advocacy activities. She also adds to her personal understanding of climate change by being a committed beekeeper and her on-hand, literally on-hand participation in her son's organic farm in Grey County. Jennifer, I turn the floor over to you and look forward to your presentation.
Thanks very much, Janet, for that introduction, and hello to everyone who's signed in now. I'm very happy to be able to speak on this topic. Yet again, there was a time after I retired in 2011 when I didn't pay a lot of attention to adaptation, but I've got back to it now. And I hope I can convince those of you who are relatively new to it about its importance today. The presentation is organized in 4 parts. So the first part, I look at why action on adaptation and resilience in the face of climate change is essential. In the second part, I take a look at Canada's national adaptation strategy and its limitations. And trust me, it does have some limitations. And thirdly, I narrow down and look at adaptation policies and action or inaction, is more the case at the moment, in Ontario. And finally, I want to introduce you to a private member's bill on climate change adaptation for Ontario that is about to be introduced. Well, sometime in the next several weeks will be introduced into the Ontario legislature by NDP MPP Peter Tabuns. Climate activists have typically worked much more on the mitigation side, which is as it should be, or was as it should be for quite a long time. Mitigation side, it focuses on causes of climate change and on the measures to reduce emissions to avoid future impacts of climate. Reducing climate emissions is not going to reduce impacts in the near future. That's a longer term goal, really. Adaptation, on the other hand, looks at focusing on the impacts of climate change more than on the causes, and introduces measures that reduce both current and future impacts. This is really important. If you're not doing enough on mitigation, then it's much harder to adapt. And so that I think both of those pillars of action are really important. So why adaptation? Well, first of all, mitigation is simply not enough. As I indicated, there have been so many carbon emissions in the atmosphere, and they take so long to resolve that the impacts of climate change are really baked in for centuries to come. Another reason that is really important is that climate impacts, are most dramatic for vulnerable people. We think about that in terms of international effects of climate change, small climate states that are being inundated as sea level rises, African countries who are dramatically affected by droughts. We think of Pakistan a couple of years ago, where a third of the country was flooded, and extreme heat, which is occurring in many parts of the world. So when we do a serious and comprehensive adaptation program, we are also focused on reducing the impacts for the most vulnerable of people. In Canada, those are people who live in the inner city, poor people who live in the inner cities, for example. They are Indigenous people who live in the north of Canada and are inundated with floods, have their ice roads disappearing, and are otherwise impacted by climate impacts. And finally, another really important reason for doing adaptation and doing it now is that the huge repair costs of the kinds of impacts we're seeing, whether they're wildfires or floods or extreme heat, the costs of repairing those, of dealing with those emergencies, diverts funding and resources from emissions reduction and from social programs. And I'll have more to say about that in later slides. So climate change, I'm sure you all know this, but I'm going to do a quick review of it in any case. Climate change brings fierce weather. There's also actually slower impacts of climate change, but I'm not going to address those today. So in Canada, over the last few years, we've seen BC's heat dome, for example, that killed 619 people. and actually dramatically increased the wildfires in the province. And it was followed a couple of years later, or a couple of months later, sorry, by the atmospheric river. First time most of us had ever heard that term, which caused massive floods, mudslides, road and bridge washouts, and also killed several people. In the prairies, over the last couple of years, there have been really serious problems with heat and drought that's been withering wheat, barley, and canola crops that are exported. And so they farmer livelihoods, but they also affect the availability of grains in other parts of the world who need them. In Ontario and Quebec last year, we had a major derecho which downed trees, hydro poles, transmission towers, and killed 10 people. A lot of damage, particularly in the Ottawa area. In Atlantic Canada, the hurricane Fiona a couple of years ago caused 5 deaths. It displaced 13,000 people, and it cost more than $4 billion in damages to repair. That was followed in Atlantic Canada by major floods last year and wildfires that were surprisingly, but risking parts of Halifax. And speaking of wildfires, of course, last year's wildfires were really dramatic across the whole of Canada. There were more than 6,000 wildfires in Canada in 2023, which burned 16.5 million, 4 times more than any previous year. And we have had big wildfire years in the past, but they're promising to get worse. And we're definitely going to be facing similar kinds of problems this summer. So the impacts of extreme weather are compounded by the way we have developed the country since settlers arrived here. One of the things we've done a lot of is to destroy natural systems such as wetlands. Ontario only has about 10% of the wetlands that existed 100 or 200 years ago. And that means that we're much less capable, for example, of absorbing and managing water from the more and more intense rainstorms that are happening as a result of climate change. Our unsustainable urban and suburban systems, which are dominated by concrete and asphalt, also make it really difficult to adapt to extreme weather. They increase heat. You find the centers of cities often anywhere from 6 to 10 degrees C higher than any of the surrounded natural areas. And concrete and asphalt also makes it really difficult to deal with intense rainfalls because the rain has nowhere to go except sometimes into our basements, into our streets, into our bridges. I know one person on this call had her car simply flooded from bottom well up into the car when she was caught in an underpass in Toronto during a big rainstorm a couple of years ago. So adapting to climate change actually requires us to make changes in a number of these practices. Another real problem with the impacts is not just the risks to life and limb and the risks to our homes and our buildings and our infrastructure, but the costs. And I mentioned this previously. A couple of years, or in 2022, this task force on flood insurance and relocation reported, and it estimated that about $2.9 billion costs were occurring as a result of residential flood risk across the country. The Insurance Bureau of Canada looked at the end of 2023 at how much their insurers, their members, had paid out in insured damage due to severe weather and discovered that 3.1 billion had been paid out in insured damage in that year alone. This is insured damage. It doesn't cover all the people who don't have insurance, either because they don't have the money for it or because insurance companies are not prepared to insure them because they live in particularly vulnerable areas. And we see insurance companies pulling out more and more of areas that are vulnerable to floods, for example. So what does it mean to adapt? There's a lot of definitions of adaptation. I've chosen a fairly simple and straightforward one here. To anticipate, the anticipation part is really important to reduce and to avoid the impacts of climate change by making current systems less vulnerable and more resilient. So I have a few examples here of the thousands that are available. One example is to strengthen building codes to make homes and other buildings more resilient. This has been problematic. Actually, the National Building Code, which the federal government develops every few years, is starting to incorporate resiliency measures that would reduce, for example, the impact on homes and buildings from very strong winds or tornadoes that lift roofs and then send the debris from that into the windows of other homes and so on. And just we've seen a lot of that in recent years in Ontario as our tornado alley expands and increases in intensity. Another example of adapting would be to reduce heat impacts by increasing green and blue spaces in cities. Avoiding new development in floodplains. The conservation authorities in Ontario have been trying to do this for years, and they're coming up against more and more difficulties in actually preventing that development in floodplains. But we also have to think about, as the group that did the assessment of on a national level of flooding potential in Canada, we have to think about maybe relocating some buildings and some developments that are in floodplains now and are particularly vulnerable to high water. We can reinforce transmission towers to withstand heavy winds and ice storms. And as I say, there are thousands more options for adapting to climate change depending on the system. One of the things that can help us think about the importance of adaptation and adding adaptation to our climate actions is the fact that there are many ways in which these two types of strategies can be made synergistic. So in mitigation, we have been proposing and backing government action to end fossil fuel subsidies, the electrification of the economy, expanding renewable energy conservation programs, and public transportation, for example, among the many things you can do to mitigate climate change. On the adaptation side, those people who are working on the field have been calling for upgrades to stormwater systems, the development of cooling centers so that people who are exposed to extreme heat have somewhere to go and rest away from heat, backflow valves to prevent sewage coming up through your basements when the water levels outside are high and the rainfall is intense, reinforcing bridges so people aren't falling into streams and aren't having to go around while bridges get rebuilt, and protecting and expanding wetlands. So those are some of the things you can do on either side, but in the middle are a whole number of options where we can actually do both at the same time. So for example, New York City has a cool roof project, and actually they're doing some of this in Texas too, if you can believe it. But the cool roofs, they put this white membranes on roofs that reflect sunlight back and allow the buildings below to be cooler. It helps with reducing energy use for air conditioning, for example, too, and so reduces emissions in that way. So it combines adaptation, protection against climate impacts, and mitigation at the same time. Similarly, I've mentioned urban green spaces. Building insulation will reduce emissions, plus it'll reduce the impacts of, in particular, heat. And regenerative agriculture reduces emissions from soils, for example, and it also makes farmland more resilient to droughts. So cutting the costs of climate change. So again, to cut the costs of climate change, we have to do both mitigation and adaptation. But the truth is, and we need to face it, that mostly mitigation and adaptation are very costly. The Canadian Climate Institute, which produces a lot of good research, on both mitigation and adaptation, has done a series of recent studies that were published in 2022 that show that doing both mitigation and adaptation reduces the cost of climate change over time. In one of their publications called Damage Control, they produced this kind of illustrative diagram. It doesn't actually have uh, actual figures in place, but this is what they show happens. So on the bar on the far left, you see what could be the full cost of climate change if no action, either mitigation or adaptation, occurs. You can see either doing strong adaptation programs or emissions programs that reduce emissions from high to low emission scenarios can cut climate costs as much as in half in the impact areas that they analyzed in any case. But if you combine adaptation programs together, you can cut climate costs by 3/4. You're not going to cut it all together. We're still going to have damage from climate change, but you can dramatically reduce that damage and reduce the costs. The Peter Tabbins in the NDP asked the Ontario Financial Accountability Office back in 2021, back a century, in 2021, to do reports on 3 areas of infrastructure that in Ontario, and to look at adaptation costs, climate impact and adaptation costs for stormwater, for buildings, and for transportation infrastructure. And so what you see on the left is the cover of the report they produced on stormwater and wastewater. And if you look at the graph then on the right-hand side, you'll see 2 sets of bar graphs. So the set on the left is the costs in an medium emission scenario, and the bars on the right show the costs on a high emission scenario. And we're talking in billions of dollars here. So the pink bars show what the costs would be with no adaptation. Interestingly enough, the blue costs show what they call reactive adaptation would be. So in the case of stormwater systems here, trying to fix a stormwater system after you've had a major flood, for example, is actually going to be more expensive, they estimate, a little bit more expensive, 89 billions as opposed to 88 billion for doing nothing at all. That actually surprised me, but this bears out for both the medium emissions and the high emissions scenarios. Whereas if you look at the cost of adaptation, and again, it's not cheap, they could reduce those costs over time to, in the case of the medium emissions scenario, 71 billion, in the case of a high emissions scenario from 148 billion to 127 billion. So this was really kind of interesting to me, but it should have made the case to the Ontario government that really moving on adaptation would, in the long run, save them a lot of money. So when we start to plan for adaptation, there are a number of steps that we need to take, and basically all the adaptation literature says the same. So first, we need to raise awareness, share knowledge, and build capacity just to think about what are the things that are coming down the tube from climate change. What are higher and higher emissions going to cause in terms of wind, high winds, very intense rainstorms, and heat, and so on. So we need to raise awareness of the public, but also of the politicians, and of civil servants who are working on these issues. We need to assess and prioritize the risks and vulnerabilities. We need to set goals and clear targets. So by 2023, too late for 2023, by 2030, we will have assessed bridges in Ontario that are at risk from being wiped out by floods, for example. And our target for 2030 will be to have assessed the risks for all of those and to have improved the resilience of, say, 40% of the bridges, especially the ones that are full vulnerability in the province. So this is the task of setting goals and targets. Then you make your adaptation plans. You can actually do some of this while you're setting goals and targets. And they might be at the sectoral level. So how are we going to reduce impacts in agriculture, for example? They might be at the local level. How are we going to help municipalities reduce the impacts in cities and towns around the province? That might be regional and it might be national. We have to think both about structural or gray defenses as well as nature-based solutions. So the gray defenses might include things like flood defenses, berms along the edges of rivers where residential communities come and either smack up near those into flood zones, or resilient buildings. But nature-based solutions, like I've mentioned previously, wetlands and forests and other kinds of solutions like that can also reduce impacts. So while we're waiting, or while these solutions are being put into effect, we still have to protect against the climate kinds of impacts and disasters that are going to continue to happen. And one is to provide effective early warning systems. This is a serious problem in British Columbia during the atmospheric river, where many communities didn't really get any kind of warning that flooding was going to happen until it was already upon them, and couldn't really do very much themselves. We saw this particularly in farms that were inundated with water and where they were trying to remove livestock, for example, into flooded areas. And a lot of livestock got lost as a result of that. We need to plan for disasters and provide emergency services. And they have to be better than the kinds of emergency services that are currently used, for example, where northern Indigenous communities are being evacuated and flown out at last minute notice, and where people are sitting in motels and so on in southern communities waiting and waiting and waiting for the flood waters to recede. And we need to encourage individual behavior changes. So I'm going to shift now into the national adaptation strategy. So what the plans, we talked about planning and what needs to be incorporated into the development of a strategy and plans for adaptation. So the feds have talked about adaptation for more than 2 decades, both before, during, and after the Harper government, which was 2006 to 15. I started work on adaptation in 2004. And at the time, Environment Canada actually had an adaptation division that was doing work. Several of the members of this adaptation division were very involved in the IPCC developing their adaptation chapters. And they were helpful with people really all across Canada who are concerned about climate impacts. I could call up people and say, gee, I'm concerned about what to do about this problem in the city of Toronto and other municipalities in Ontario. What can you suggest? And they would pull up research, in many cases, research they had done themselves that would help inform what issues that I was looking at. They would attend meetings and conferences and advise people. And so they were just doing a really good job. Natural Resources Canada, Health Canada, Infrastructure Canada were also working on doing reports and recommendations to the government. And they continued to do this after the Harper government took office, but not very many of these things were being acted on in this time. I should also say when the Harper government took power, one of the first things they did was dissolve the adaptation division in Environment Canada, scatter those scientists, some of which took early retirement, some went into teaching in universities, some became consultants, but that whole team was basically dismantled and tossed out. So the Trudeau government took power in 2015, and they started to work more on climate change. Their focus was on mitigation in the beginning, although of course they still were buying fossil fuel pipelines and supporting the fossil fuel industry. But in December 2020, in part because of a push by the United Nations, Canada decided it was going to develop its first strategy. And I have to say that the feds did a fairly good job on consulting and opportunities for comment in this strategy. They had a lot of meetings. They got together task force groups to work in different areas, and they particularly involved a lot of Indigenous leaders in the discussion. They produced a draft national adaptation strategy in November 2022, and they put it out for discussion and received 100 submissions, more than 100 submissions, that provided more advice on the final strategy. So as part of Seniors for Climate Action Now, I worked on a submission to the Government of Canada. We looked particularly at impacts for seniors, and we provided 11 recommendations, which I'm sorry to say the government didn't really take up in their final strategy. But if any of you are interested, you might want to look at that submission, and we'll make a link available to it. So the National Adaptation Strategy, the final version of it, was published in June 2023, and there were two documents that I'm going to take a look at here. One was a general strategy for all levels of government across Canada, private sector, and so on. And the other was a specific plan for actions by the federal government in its own areas of jurisdiction. So the National Adaptation Strategy, the way they developed this strategy, developed these 5 working groups on nature and biodiversity, disaster resilience, economy and workers, infrastructure, and health and well-being. And they, for each of these areas, these task forces developed broad goals and objectives for adaptation. I'll show you some examples. So in nature and biodiversity, their broad goal, or part of their broad goal, was, and they were looking to say 2030 in the future. By 2030, and I'm not actually certain that that was the date that they had in mind, but by a particular time in the future, biodiversity loss has been halted and reversed, and nature has fully recovered, allowing for natural and human adaptation. It's a very lofty goal. Some of the objectives that that narrowed down the goals included human activities are transformed to halt and reverse biodiversity loss and enhance ecosystem connectivity and resilience. Another objective was the use of nature-based solutions would be accelerated to increase resilience. And finally, that ecosystems most affected by climate change would be monitored. They also indicated that there's a foundation for the strategy that needed goals and objectives. So we need to increase knowledge and understanding, for example. And their goal was that a robust evidence base would be created for adaptation through the development, stewarding, and sharing of existing and new data. That tools and resources would be developed, including sustained, sufficient, and equitable public and private funding, and that governance and leadership, effective governance and leadership, would occur. So I remember reading the National Adaptation Strategy and thinking, as the diagram down in the right-hand side suggests, this is a lot of blah, 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 but really, what are they going to do? Which brings us to the plan over time. So the National Adaptation Strategy, the government recognized it's not going to be rolled out all at once. And they had a plan that would take it out over about the next 12 to 15 years. It starts on the left, if you look, with the national assessment reports, which were done prior to developing the strategy, which they look regionally in different parts of Canada and what are the impacts that we have to be concerned about and how ready are we for these impacts. Then, as you see, after 2022, the development of the strategy itself, and the Federal Action Plan, so both of which were published again in the middle of 2023. So right now, the next two stages are work that the federal government is doing, first of all, with Indigenous climate leadership to develop adaptation planning for Indigenous communities. And then secondly, the FPT action plans refers to negotiations that are currently going on between the federal government and each of the provinces and territories to develop action plans in their areas. I'd really like to be a fly on the wall of the federal Ontario discussions that are going on right now, because Ontario, as you'll later, is not really moving on adaptation that I've been able to find out. And I don't know how much they're going to dig in their heels in this negotiation with the federal government about putting something serious in place. I'm not going to go through the rest of the timeline here, but you can see that you have the plans that go out over several years, progress reports that are unfortunately only planned for every 5 years, when in fact they should be happening every year or so we can see what in fact is happening on the ground. So the National Action Plan is really where the rubber should hit the road in terms of national strategy. And the National Action Plan outlined 73 actions that the federal government could or would undertake to advance adaptation in the country. But when we took a close look at them, most of these were existing programs. So the federal government was doing things on adaptation. For example, the federal flood mapping guideline series, in which they were saying to people, this is how you can do flood mapping across the country and begin to identify your areas that are vulnerable to floods. They had a wildfire satellite. Actually, it isn't in place yet, but expects to be in place in the next few years, where they can monitor at the beginning of wildfires and get onto them more quickly. They have an infectious disease and climate change program, looking at things like the increase in Lyme disease as a result of the expansion of the Black Lake and tick as winters warm in Canada. They have the 2 billion trees program, the Climate Resilient Built Environment Initiative, and an on-farm climate action fund, which at my son's farm we've tried to take advantage of and haven't succeeded so far. But the fact is that there were only 9 areas where the federal government was putting in new and expanded money. Into the wildfire resilient futures, into flood hazard mapping, so not only doing the guidelines that they've been previously doing, but actually on the ground mapping, to a program to protect Canadians from extreme heat, disaster mitigation and adaptation fund, and other kinds of activities. So there were only, as I say, expanded investments in 9 of the 73 actions that they had listed as part of their plan. Now, it still looked pretty good. Those 73 actions looked pretty good, except their new investments were only for $3.3 billion over several years. And when Environmental Defense did an analysis of government subsidies for fossil fuel and petrochemical industries in an even smaller time period, just for 2023, you can see that what they were looking to put into adaptation was maybe a fifth of what was going into actually not even mitigation, but pumping more emissions into the environment. So it's still a far cry from what we need. Now, the feds are constrained in doing adaptation by the division of powers. So they only have the power over the areas of jurisdiction that where certainly impacts will occur, but not where the major impacts will occur across the country. So they have jurisdiction for fisheries, for seacoasts and shipping, for federal lands, for Indigenous peoples' reserves, for national railways and airports, pipelines, and then they have shared jurisdiction with the provinces on agricultural and natural resources. But really, provincial jurisdiction is where adaptation is most needed. And some of those areas are, for example, electricity systems within provincial borders, waters within provincial boundaries. Actually, in the electricity systems, we see the iconic photograph of the transmission towers that were taken down by the ice storm in 1998. And it shows the power that extreme weather can have. Interprovincial transportation is also the responsibility of the provinces. And land use planning, think of the green belt, building regulations, public health, municipalities control about 65% of infrastructure that's vulnerable to climate change in Canada. And the provinces determine how much support municipalities get to fix their stormwater systems, to improve their transportation systems, to roll out extreme heat programs. And frankly, they're not getting very much help on provincial lands and parks. So I'm going to shift into Ontario now more. And I want to give a little history because I think it's important to understand that we're not at ground zero in Ontario, or we don't have to be, in terms of doing adaptation. The Liberal government in 2007 convened an expert panel on climate change and asked them to develop a major report and recommendations on adapting to climate change in Ontario. You wouldn't know from the Ford government that this had ever happened previously. And this was the first major Ontario analysis on adaptation for the province. And the expert panel did a good job. They made 59 very specific recommendations for action by the Ontario government for adaptation in agriculture, energy, infrastructure, health, biodiversity, and other parts of the responsibilities of the province. Actually, let me tell you a little bit more about this. This expert panel was led by Ian Burton and David Pearson. I think Ian Burton was in Environment Canada, and at the beginning of work being done in Environment Canada about adaptation, and was also a very key member in the IPCC work on adaptation. So he knew a lot going into this, and David Pearson is not only did make great contributions to this report and to adaptation in Ontario afterwards, but he also is currently working, and he's in his mid-80s now, but he's currently working with Indigenous communities in Ontario's north on adaptation planning. So what was the Liberal government response to this? Well, they responded pretty quickly, actually. So the report came in 2009, and by 2011, the Ontario government had an adaptation strategy and action plan in place. It wasn't as ambitious as what the expert panel was proposing, but they did start work on adaptation in several ministries, including environment, health, and natural resources, and elsewhere. Unfortunately, a lot of that work was kind of piecemeal and uncoordinated, so whatever particular ministry could do on its own by itself and work into its budget was being done. But many of the expert panel recommendations were ignored. Now, early in 2018, under the Kathleen Wynne government, there seemed to be a renewed interest in adaptation occurring. And some of it might have been as a result of pressure from Ontario's Environmental Commissioner, Diane Sachs, at that point was doing reports about adaptation and the piecemeal nature of it occurring at the level of the Ontario government. And the other thing they were investing in was a new adaptation resource center. And this resource center had been recommended by the expert panel and was recommended also by the Environmental Commissioner. And the government hired John Godfrey, who some of you may know, to develop a major adaptation resource center. Now, every other province in Canada had access to a resource center. The Prairie Province Resource Center was pretty small, but BC has a major one, and Quebec has a major resource center called Uranos that has more than 100 staff working on adaptation in that province. So the Ontario government, under the Liberals, was planning to set up this resource center. They'd even leased space near the legislature in which to house it, but then we had the 2018 election. Just before I get into what happened after 2018, I want to point out that in Ontario, adaptation planning wasn't just happening, or the adaptation work wasn't just happening at the level of the Ontario government, but many regional governments and many municipalities were working on adaptation plans and strategies. Some of these adaptation strategies were parts of combined climate action plans for mitigation and adaptation, and some were specific to standalone adaptation strategies, like the City of Toronto's in 2008. The big problem is that there was limited capacity to implement these strategies. Many of them were done by consultants rather than being done in-house. So a lot of the people working in city governments were not necessarily learning while doing their assessments of risks and strategies that could be undertaken. But more than that, municipalities, as we know, are really strapped for funds. And given the costs of adaptation, many of them have had huge problems actually implementing some of the strategic plans that they've developed. So, October 2018, we have a new election, and guess who takes power? And not only does the new Ford government end all the renewable energy programs in the province and many of the other mitigation strategies that have been undertaken, but they abandoned a lot of the adaptation activities. Not only did they abandon these activities, but they tried to erase the knowledge of some of these. If you go back and look at the government's website, and look for links to documents that came out, for example, in the teens, from different ministries or from consultants to different ministries, you'll find that sometimes these have disappeared off the website of the government, or the links to them have been broken. And it's been really frustrating for me to go back and try to see what the government was doing in this period. But inexplicably, in 2019, appointed an advisory panel on climate change. I just didn't understand why they were doing this, because they clearly weren't interested in climate change. But they appointed an advisory panel, which actually had some good people on it, to provide expert advice on preparing for the climate impacts of climate change. Now, the remit for this panel was quite a bit smaller than the remit for the previous expert panel that the Liberals had proposed, but they were still asked to provide advice, and they did. And they produced a report in 2021. And that report has never been publicly released, and none of the recommended measures have been enacted. So, second thing that the Ford government done that was also inexplicable to me was late in 2020, before their advisory panel had reported, they commissioned a provincial climate change impact assessment. And they put a lot of resources into this assessment. They paid for a lot of consultants to participate in the development of this, of what actually wasn't one assessment, but 4 linked reports. I want to mention 2 here because I think they are the 2 key reports. One is the Provincial Climate Change Impact Technical Report, which is 480 odd pages, and the other is the Adaptation Best Practices Report. So the impact assessment looked at climate change emissions projections, and then figured out in the future from 2030, 2040, 2050 and on what the likely impacts were from different emission scenarios. And they did a pretty good job. The Adaptation Best Practices Report ways in which adaptation could be developed in different parts of the province. They looked at other parts of the world where adaptation is underway, and they looked at the literature where suggestions had been made that looked good, and they included these in the report. But 8 months after this group, the government had not released these reports. So I was part of Seniors for Climate Action Now. I am part of Seniors for Climate Action Now, and we decided to campaign to get these reports released. And I know several of the people, probably many of the people who are attending this webinar, participated in this in some capacity or other. We gathered more than 1,500 names in a period of about 6 weeks in the summer of 2023, and we plan to release our open letter at a press conference in Queen's Park in September. We delayed too long, actually. The government got wind of this plan, and they quietly released the technical report so that if we had gone ahead with that press conference, they would have said, "Wow, what are you talking about? We've released this report." They did it on Friday afternoon at 5 o'clock, the last Friday in August, when nobody was paying attention. The legislature was not in happening. And in fact, they were quite effective for a while because it was about 10 days before anybody noticed that they'd actually put this up on their website. When we noticed, we prepared a press release, and Peter Tabbins of the NDP prepared a press conference. And this resulted in a flurry of media coverage for about a week in September. There was a lot of attention paid to the impact report and the problems that it promised for Ontario and the need for adaptation. But still, the other reports were not released. So then we embarked on a Freedom of Information campaign. And again, I have to acknowledge that several of the people who are attending this webinar participated in this campaign, sent Freedom of Information requests to the government, calling on the government to release all these other reports. It took about a month or maybe a little longer, but the government finally, individuals who had sent the Freedom of Information requests, they still have not put these reports on the website. The reports are still not publicly available. So Stan, we've put these reports on our website. I have to say they haven't had that many visits. And the government still won't publicly release or discuss these reports. So they really don't want us talking about climate impacts or adaptation. So that brings me to the fourth part of my presentation. In February, Peter Tabbins approached Stan and asked us to help him draft a private member's bill, which would be called the Ontario Climate Change Adaptation and Resilience. And we agreed. And we developed this bill. We drew on the suppressed reports and the adaptation literature. And we prepared a draft that is right now undergoing kind of legal rewrite. And we're planning to present, or Peter is planning to present this to the legislature in late May. There are four major components to this bill. One is the strategic action plan, that sets out 55 different measures that were asked that the government, if it were to pass this bill, would agree to undertake to protect us from heat, flooding, and so on. It includes an Ontario Climate Adaptation Fund. It includes a whole of government coordination secretariat, which was recommended by the expert committee back in 2009, and also by the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario. And it includes an Ontario Climate Change Adaptation and Resilience Resource Center. So the Strategic Action Plan contains 10 different sections. And as I said, identifies a whole series of very specific actions that if the government were to pass this bill, they would be undertaking. So it expands flood protection, extreme heat preparedness, protections against intense storms, reducing the impacts of wildfires, resilience in infrastructure and agriculture, and so on. Just to give you a sample of the measures, we had 9 specific measures just for the extreme heat section. And it involved creating maps of areas that were particularly vulnerable to extreme heat, to track data on heat-related deaths and illnesses, which Ontario does not currently do. It's pretty hard to determine where your work should be focused if you don't know how many people are dying or sick because of extreme heat. To require official plans to assess and reduce urban heat islands, to provide funding for municipalities for urban cooling strategies, and so on. So we had a whole series of specific measures that are part of the bill. Also, as I said, we wanted a whole of government adaptation secretariat, which was a mistake that the Liberals didn't do, which would coordinate implementation across the ministries. It would report to the Ontario legislature on the progress of adaptation planning. It would engage with relevant municipal climate adaptation bodies and with external experts and Indigenous nations. The resource center then would do some of the things that Uranos is doing in Quebec and beyond, and it would be a go-to source of information on climate impacts and adaptation. It would improve access to climate data, which is now broken up all over the place and sometimes impossible for a lay person to understand. It would host communities of practice, so farmers who need to think about, well, how do we protect ourselves from adaptation? What are the actions the government should take? So bringing these people together to work and talk and think about this. It would assist with training, workshops, and webinars, advise on adaptation policies, and really importantly, evaluate and report annually on adaptation progress in the province. So my husband calls this the imperious finger, so I apologize for this graphic, but we are looking for support on the process of this climate adaptation and resilience bill. So first of all, we will notify anybody here who would like to be notified, and through call and scan and other means, when we have a date for the presentation of the bill. So you can watch for it when it goes to the legislature. We fully expect that it will get short shrift in the legislature, that the Conservatives will not allow for a full reading of the bill. But just introducing it to the legislature means you have a really good reason to do a press conference. You inform the media about it, hopefully raise the issue of adaptation again. We will be looking for letters of support from people who are attending this meeting and your colleagues, and from the organizations you belong to. And we're hoping to organize a demonstration in front of the legislature when the bill is presented to grab media attention to the issue and to show that there's support for this to happen at the level of the province. So thank you very much, and I welcome your comments.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for this. It's been really comprehensive. I think there were a number of things in this that sort of highlighted for me the role of adaptation versus the work that generally is done by environmental groups on mitigation. And I think the sort of reason for adaptation, the question of cost and shifting resources from social programs and from mitigation efforts will happen if we don't deal with adaptation, because the cost of the damages that will occur are really intense. So it really highlighted for me the role of adaptation, and your point about raising awareness, sharing knowledge, and building capacity everywhere, not just amongst ourselves, but also with decision makers, whether it be government or business or municipal leaders, et cetera. All of that is so critical. And then, of course, that leads us to the bill. And that's exactly where all of this is heading, is to something very concrete that if a government adopted, would speed adaptation forward. Although it's going to be a struggle with this particular government. So we've got some questions from the chat. Now, let me start with those. Jane is wondering whether the federal government has any authority to require provinces or municipalities to strengthen building codes or any adaptation strategies like building codes.
No, it doesn't. What the federal government can do is to make funding available, tied funding. They have made funding available for other programs in the past where they haven't been specific enough to the provinces about what it has to be used for. Like a lot of health funding, for example, has gone into general coffers of the provinces and not used for what the federal government intended it for. So it's in those kinds of ways. By doing national codes, they're doing infrastructure codes, for example, but the problem is that the provinces have to adopt those codes. Some of them do it naturally, or just when the national code gets promulgated, they do it in the provinces, but they don't, Ontario is not one of them. So Ontario will take the national code and they'll pick and choose among the changes to determine whether they go into the building code in Ontario. And of course, we know that developers have a lot of sway with the government. And when they say, no, we don't want to put hurricane straps to attach our roofs to the walls of new buildings, even though they only cost a couple of bucks a piece, the Ontario government listens to that. So no, the federal government doesn't have a lot of power if something is purely in the jurisdiction of the province.
Okay, great, thanks. Keith has a question about where does the concept of using less, sort of conservation, degrowth strategies, producing and buying locally, our food and so on, and other products, of us being much better consumers, does it fit into this list of adaptation strategies? Any official approaches to adaptation that include this kind of adaptation strategy?
I don't think a lot of people working in adaptation are looking at this. If you look at, for example, the economic and piece of the national adaptation strategy, they kind of assume business as usual in the economy, and then just sort of, okay, so what do we do around mining? Do we prevent mining, for example, in Northern Ontario, where they'll obliterate wetlands, or do we just make it safer for people to mine? And they tend to go to the latter. So I would say, like, there's a lot of good people working on adaptation in the province, but a lot of them work within a fairly conventional economic framework. And they haven't yet, for the most part, begun to think about using less or doing things really differently. One of the exceptions to this might be in some of the farmers groups. So you have a Farmers for Climate Solutions group. You have the the Ecological Farmers of Ontario. The National Farmers Union, parts of the National Farmers Union, for example, are proposing changes to farming practices that would support, for example, more local production of foods, and which would reduce transportation problems, and would think about making us more resilient in the long term, more food secure. So there are sort of some people working on some of these areas, but across the board, not yet. That might be for us to do.
Great, thanks. Shelley's wondering whether you have any comment on what a priority focus might be for adaptation in the city of Toronto.
Yeah, I was afraid of this question.
Well, here it is.
No, it's partly because really I was out of adaptation for many years and have only gone back into it. And my focus has been primarily at the level of the province. And I keep saying to myself, I have to look more at Toronto's transition strategy because I know they're thinking about this. Flooding and extreme heat, in my view, would be the two major issues that the city needs to be really, really focused on. But I don't know enough about the recent developments in the city on this. I know it's kind of renewed since the new mayor and a progressive council. And so I think they'll be working on good things, but I have yet to delve into that.
Great, thanks. Rita wonders if there are any suggestions on how can our decision makers be educated on adaptation? How do we implement a climate lens for decision makers? What are some of the strategies that we might use?
Oh boy, I wish I had an answer to that. I think with respect to adaptation, it's when climate impacts occur that we put huge, and there'll continue to be impacts this summer. I'm fully expecting The forest fires are going to be a problem. Heat and flooding are going to be problems in parts of Ontario. Part of the problem is that a lot of the impacts are localized. So a lot of people didn't know about the derechos in Ottawa, which did so much damage. So getting the government as a whole to focus on that, or the provincial government as a whole to focus on that, is difficult. But I think if you take these individual events and go after your MPP and the government as a whole and say, we need to be doing things. And if you take a look at the plan that's going forward around, we've got a list of 9 things they can do on heat, that we've got a list of 11 things they can do on floods, and start demanding that the government do it, raise it. But I think the particularly good time to do that is when we see these events happening, and they're going to continue happening. There's going to be lots of opportunity to raise our voices.
Good, thanks. Liz had a question, and there were lots of comments in the chat on this as well. But Toronto has buried or channeled many of its rivers and creeks over the years.
Mm.
Would it be useful to open these up and let them serve as natural reservoirs?
Yes, I think so. It's not going to be easy because there's a lot of houses built on top of those areas. And this is where we talk about the costs of climate change being quite expensive. The city of Vancouver has actually done a lot of interesting work over the years, not so much to open up buried streams and things like that, but to create alongside roads and in areas and so on. They developed swales, low-lying areas with pebbles and so on, and also with plants that can withstand the impacts of water, and water flows into these areas. They provide green spaces, they provide some blue spaces in the city, which provide for cooling, but also take care of overflows of water. So some of that's probably a less expensive approach than trying to bring up some. But there are places where they are actually bringing those streams back to light, if not for the full length of them in certain kinds of areas. And for sure, they can be protective.
Great. Keith is wondering what is the relation, if any, between municipal adaptation plans versus federal or provincial mandates? Is there any synchronicity between these levels of government? Is there conversation happening that would speed this along?
Well, there is conversation happening. What the Federation of Canadian Municipalities has actually been quite active on both mitigation and adaptation for quite a long time. And they work quite closely with a group called ICLEI. And ICLEI has a group of people that's done training with municipalities, and they get some funding nationally for this, on developing adaptation plans and so on at the municipal level. But as I said, I mean, the municipal level, even though the municipalities have responsibility for the areas within their borders, for infrastructure in particular, really they're constrained or supported by provincial governments that supply funding and guidelines and help in developing the plans and implementing these plans. So we see more of that help occurring in places like Quebec. Actually, I'm going to be attending a webinar this afternoon on what Halifax is doing, and it's actually getting some support from the Nova Scotia government. The federal government actually produced a report on municipalities and how to help municipalities, but really this division of powers is a major impediment, I think, to developing this more evenly across the country.
Right. Thank you. A couple of questions on the legislation, and I think we'll be done with the Q&A.
Yeah.
One is, has the legislation that has been drafted been shared with the Green Party or Diane Sachs as being people who would be allies in this, or is it just going ahead through the NDP only?
Well, I don't know.
A question for them, eh?
We're yeah, we're going to have a meeting which will include this question sometime in the next very short period. And my hope is that we can get co-sponsors from the Liberals and the Greens. When we first started calling for the release of the reports, we actually had quite a bit of support from both Mike Schreiner and the Greens and from Mary Margaret McMahon in the Liberals. And there's another Liberal MPP whose name, Stephanie Morrow, maybe, who's been quite supportive and has herself actually done a private member's bill on stormwater infrastructure. So it would be really nice to see this, whether we can get, my guess is that Peter Tabuns himself, and I may be speaking out of turn, but my guess is that Peter Tabuns himself would be open to that. Whether the NDP caucus would be, I don't know.
Okay. And the last question, is there a follow-up plan when the Ford government defeats the bill?
Oh, they won't even defeat the bill. It won't go to second reading.
It won't even go to second reading. Yeah, okay.
No. Yes, well, SCAN is trying to develop, we're sort of focused on heat, flooding, and wildfires. And so we're taking some of the measures that we suggested for the bill, and we're going to try to start campaigning around them. And one of the things we're hoping to do is to, like, there's a number of groups that are meeting on heat, for example, in the province. The CAPE, the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, has been concerned about it. Canadian Environmental Law Association has been working on it. There's a local St. Jamestown group called CREW. I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but that's working on heat in the St. Jamestown apartment buildings. The Ontario Federation of Labor, the Occupational Health Clinic for Ontario Workers, they're all concerned about different aspects of heat and trying to get programs and legislation related to protecting people from heat. So we're hoping that we can draw together this group of people and develop a common strategy, a common set of demands that over the next period we can take forward, particularly if there's a big heat emergency, for example, that occurs in the coming months.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. This has been absolutely terrific. I really appreciate the work that you put into this. It's an eye opener, and it's really helpful for how we move forward. And it's very encouraging to see the collaboration that is happening around the bill and around adaptation in general. Things are starting to move in the right direction in terms of adaptation. So it's good to know.
Wow, Jennifer, that was astounding. You know, it's amazing the parallels between what we're facing now and what the world came together to face as a better way of addressing water issues back in 2000. And out of that came the whole approach called integrated water resource management, where you put lawyers and sociologists and psychologists and history buffs and all those kind of people in the same room as the town that wants more water because they've run out of it. So, you know, we need an integrated approach. And thank you very much for pointing out to all of us, a lot of us who don't recognize and admit that there's mitigation versus adaptation. I want to mention the specifically focused climateatlantic.ca website for what they're doing in Atlantic Canada with 212 members of climateatlantic.ca focused on adaptation. That's their whole reason for being. And they're a really great resource. And I further want to just lastly compliment the aspects that you brought out in terms of what we can ask people to look to in terms of their motivation for taking action in their municipality. That those steps that you outlined, I think, are fundamental and should be required reading for almost anybody who's a climate advocate. So thank you.
Thanks a lot, everybody, for spending time with us. It's always interesting to hear what people have to say beyond the presentation, which was, as I think we've all said, Jennifer, really helpful and really terrific. Thank you so much.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Thank you to the organizers and to Jennifer.
No problem. Take
Have
care.
a good day, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.